So, without further ado, everyone, I want to introduce our first speaker. It is Christopher Lunde. Christopher is a Norwegian architect currently working in Copenhagen. He's going to talk to you today about the language of the Lithic. I had never even heard of that word, so Chris is going to tell us what it's all about. Chris and I met when we were interns. We both worked in Holland together, and that was maybe a decade ago, something like that. And ever since, have stayed in contact and have a lot of shared interests in architecture. So the fact that he's here today is evidence that your peers that are around you now will probably become life friends. They could become partners. They could become business partners. They could become all of these. So, really see each other as potential collaborators for the future. So I'll let Chris get straight into it.
Actually, the Lithic, just 2 weeks ago, I didn't know what it meant either. But again, this is what I'm actually going to try to explain you throughout the lecture. But the language, I think for me, really matters, because I do feel that architecture is a language. It's something that you can study and you can kind of analyze. So the first thing I want to look at is like these different ways of lithic. So basically, lithic, it comes from lithos. It's like ancient Greek for stone. And maybe the one you're most familiar with is the monolithic. That's basically when it comes from monos, which is like single, alone. So it refers to something which has a certain singularity. The megalithic is like typical with the Stonehenge. It's like you have a structure which is sort of big blocks. And in the one in the middle is sort of the big blocks is used also as a column, but also as a beam. And the polyolithic will literally be buildings made of many. I guess I have my screen here. It would literally be many stones, which is also quite common. So this is kind of just to show you that what I like actually with architecture is the fact that it has a certain, it doesn't really change that much. So this is kind of interesting because you literally have to deal with gravity, and gravity is always there. So you can kind of clearly see this when you have, this is two structures, one is Egyptian, the other one is Greek. That actually is a little bit the same system. And this is kind of still what we use. You see this lecture hall, you have two columns. Probably above it you have two beams. And you can kind of add to that, you can add the arch or you can add the dome, which is also present both in Egypt and Greece. But this is kind of what we have to work with. And when we speak about the lithic, I would say like the third category is, of course, you have natural stone, but you have also all the stone that is man-made. Which kind of concrete is one of the most kind of famous one. So I think often with concrete, now it also has a very bad reputation, but I think we have to remember that, let's say, all of Rome, for example, is built with concrete. So this is what they did, is kind of like they built a structure in concrete, and then they would add bricks or stone or whatever to sort of embellish the concrete structure, right? So actually in this image, you can sort of see actually all the different types, let's say in the lithic language. You have like the concrete, you have the brick, the natural stone on the floor, and so on. And so, yeah, so what I did today is I'm actually going, since you are students, I went back also to a lot of the work I did as a student. So this is one of them. This was kind of really trying to investigate, okay, so what is architecture all about at the end, because you have to, of course, you have to put a toilet there, it has to be a staircase and so on. But I feel at the end, for me at least, it's really about this thing, you have material and you have light. And I would say preferably daylight. And it's really like the interaction of these two components that make a space. So I was lucky to have a kind of, it was the design school. They have a place where you can cut stones. So this was just literally to go into a place and buy the stones and kind of with that saw, it was literally to kind of cut strips. And then with that, you already have kind of a language, right? You have your components. This is what I could work with, right? and then you kind of put them together in a certain composition, and you see how the daylight react to this material. Yeah. So this is another one. I mean, what is to take away from these studies, I think, is really that I would say sculpture and also architecture to a large extent is really about, it's not so much about form, but it's really about light. So what you see is that if you have a surface and you start to kind of sculpt it, you start to make shape, what you do is actually you start to draw shadows. You start to draw with light. And this was also quite a sort of revelation that you can do that, right? The last one I want to, of this, like, not the last one, we're not finished, but but this was another one of stone, let's say, where I became a bit kind of obsessed with it. So I started to map all the stones, all the marbles in Norway, and realized that many of them were sort of lost. And this was kind of quite an incredible experience where, for example, with this one, I came to the quarry, it was in the middle of the woods. It was quite amazing. It was actually also raining. So when we saw the quarry, it was really like bright green, like this one, And I think this is also part of the language of stone, is that actually some stones are so beautiful that you don't really have to do anything. At least for me, you don't have to shape it, nothing. You can just kind of keep it. So this is another example where actually I brought this as well because this is just cardboard. What you see that what happens when you sort of take away the material, you also start to lose a bit of direction. And I think this is what is not so good actually there's a lot of good things I think with this image, but I think what is not so good is that you don't understand why these columns, why are they thin? What is this material? Is it steel? What is this roof? It becomes is not precise enough, So say if you were to take this model a step further, you would really say, okay, either we make it really thin, we make it like really like steel, or we start to play with let's say you have to kind of, I think material really matters, and it really can really steer your project in a certain direction. Yes, so let's say from these like more abstract studies, what I remember as a student, I was always pushed by the teacher to kind of make it work, because they were a bit like, okay, this looks fine, but you also have to it has to work. So what I started to look at, this is a very famous diagram of Le Corbusier, where he sort of, he laid out in a way, or like he made it into a drawing how we build today. If you see a structure that is more than, let's say, 3-4 stories, most likely it will be built like this. So you have the structure is put a bit into it's a bit pushed in so that you can work quite freely with the facade. And then basically to move from one floor to the other, you need to have a staircase. So this is also what it sort of shows. So I wanted to make my own sort of version of this scheme or this diagram. And what was the thought is that what if we sort of hide all the circulation, all mechanics, everything, we hide it inside the column itself. So what you're left with is this kind of like pure representation of solid and void. And this was kind of the first conceptual model of that. But then of course you also have to make this work. So this was, okay, I tried it on a certain typology, and this typology was the car park. And then of course when you're confronted with a specific problem, you have to react to it, right? So you see that here, for example, you have the parkings. Maybe it's not so clear in the drawing, but you have columns that are very thin, because that's to not take too much space. And then you have 4 parking spots, and then you have another column. And then the staircase is round, and the elevator is a square. It's like almost like authorless. It's almost like no individuality. It's almost like to the point that you question who made it. Okay, so this would be sort of how this type of language would look. And I think what sort of works in a way, so for me, thinness is about elegance, or is very sort of related to this word. So if you want to make something elegant, often you have to make it sort of quite thin, quite refined. And this, I guess, is represented by the column to the right, while the kind of circulation course is what really provides the body of the structure. This is sort of what gives us some kind of, I think body is actually the best way to explain it. Becomes this kind of pure repetition of almost like a system, right? And it was also, I remember here, also the tutors were really pushing to add another program, you know, like, this is too boring, you don't want a shopping mall, or we should have whatever, Tesco, whatever. And it was like super important for me that it was none of that. This was very important. And also to emphasize this, actually, I inclined all the slabs with this kind of, let's say, inclination maximum you can have when you park your car. So then you would have also, when you drive through the parking, you would have this sort of idea of compression and expansion of space while you drive. But also almost to emphasize that this could only sort of be a parking. Okay, so let's say these are both kind of etchings by Eduardo Chilila, which is he's kind of a sculpture artist, but he also makes drawings and etchings. And I think these two is kind of like a diagram, I would say. I would say like the image to the left is sculpture. It's basically you have a mass and you sort of carve out of this mass. But I would say the image to the right in a way represent architecture, because like in architecture you can't really do that in terms of just in terms of economy. You know, you can do this if you want to make a bunker where you need a lot of mass, but you need to kind of provide some kind of rationale, or you need to provide some kind of logic to it. So let's say this in a way is a sculpture by the same artist, but to make that work you really have to consider this sort of mass. I would say a bit more like a shell. Like you really have to, let's say I would love for someone to make a house that looked literally like that, but in order to make it work you really have to start carve it out. So which is kind of represented by these two drawings. Yes, so in this kind of understanding that, I started to kind of look a bit at, okay, so what is this sort of language, you know, what does it really mean? And I started to analyze different plans and realizing that actually almost all plans are kind of in the same structure, they're a bit the same, you know, they basically consist of very sort of few elements. So this is just to show you, like, I'm not going to like from year 0 to now, but it's just to kind of show you, this is a plan from Iraq, from the 3rd millennium BC, I guess, where you see that actually this figure, which I call it PR because it's actually the Egyptian hieroglyph for home, has this shape. So you see it's literally this shape, which is sort of added 6 times. And with this simplicity, you have a house. And in a way, it's kind of enough. This is the Megaron. This is kind of like the prototype of the Greek temple, or it is the Greek temple, but it's the early one. That you see is kind of like, okay, what is this thing actually? It's really like a column, it's a line, and then it's this kind of figure of the room, which is sort of has a sequence of 3. And I also think it's quite clear, actually, especially with the Greeks. You can also do this with Egypt, with Iraq, and so on. That they literally build whole cities, like really based on this very simple vocabulary. And I think you can probably kind of recognize many of the shape. I'm not going through all of them. Maybe in the later plans, I'm going a bit more detailed. So what I'm going to show you now is I'm going to show you. I wanted specifically now to show like very good and famous architects and how they work. So we say this is Peter Zumthor. He's incredibly famous. He won like Pritzker, like the Oscar, and so on. But you see when he's kind of confronted with a problem, in this case to design a museum, he's actually, what he does is very simple. This is literally like a square. And what he does, because he wants to make the exhibition space really sort of not have too many visual disturbance, he literally just put lines in front of the staircase, the elevator, and so on. This is another plan, which probably one of the most famous architectural projects, which you would probably encounter many times throughout your career. But this is the plan of it. It's the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe. And you see with Mies, he has these U shapes, and he has the line, and then he also uses this kind of T shape, which he uses a lot, and the columns have this cross, and sort of that's it. And I could really I could take all the plans of Mies, and we could add 3 or 2 more letters. So in his whole career, he kind of reduced his language to that. Yes, and then another one, this is Sumter again, this is a very famous project, is Vals. And I think here, you see this like figure, especially of this Daedalus. So basically Daedalus, he was the architect of King Minos. Yeah, but he was basically the architect of the first labyrinth. That was his thing, you know? This idea that you walk into a maze and you go further and further in. And this is a bit the theme of this project, this Vals, because from the outside, he wanted to be completely clear, the blocks, but also he need to kind of hollow them out and to give them a kind of a program. Okay, so what we have to take, and this is very interesting actually, what we talked about also yesterday with the students, with the second year, is that actually your hand sketches really matter. They do really matter, and you really have to take it seriously, because like, first of all, in a computer drawing, yes, they all look the same, but your hand sketches is really your signature. It's like one of you have the same, how you say, what do you call that? Handprint?
Yeah. Fingerprint.
Fingerprint, and no one of you have the same signature, and the same applies to drawing. And you say both of these are really one of very famous architects, and I'm sure all of you can make sketches that are equally good. You know, it's not really about if it's good or bad, but you can really clearly see the intention and also how they struggle with finding some kind of a geometry. And the same would apply with someone like Gaudi, who take this kind of simplicity of language, but he starts to bend things. I think one of the biggest inventions of Gaudi is basically to say that instead of the wall being straight, I'm always going to bend it a little bit, which gives it this kind of a quite dynamic feel. Okay, so now that was kind of that was this kind of first part. What I want to go into now is why the lithic matters, to me at least, is really because it really has to do with economy. So, you know, especially in England, like let's say high tech is really a thing. You know, you have this kind of Norman Foster, you have all these architects who, what I think they really have is they have a lot of craftsmanship, but it's also quite expensive, you know, like, so why still in Bournemouth, for example, all your houses probably is made of some kind of brick, you know, it's made of a concrete brick, of a clay brick and so on, you know, so you can imagine that actually in terms of housing, for example, you have to really deal with this language. You know, let's say if you make a big terminal, you can do something else, but this is really and for me, this is kind of a big deal, because I think I realized this for a while when I met Paul. This was like a bit after 2008. It was the first financial crisis. And I think for the first time there, we started to see that things maybe is not going to be so easy. And I think also in the future, we will have to deal with the economy we have to deal with this. You know, we're dealing also with sustainability. We have to deal with local materials and so on. I think the time where we could just kind of ship material from wherever, for me at least, is a bit gone. Like, I don't really want to involve myself with that. So what I really want to do is I want to make really beautiful buildings for everyone. And this is this is a young Danish practice who sort of started doing that, where they said, okay, we take this like almost like the most, the cheapest way and most easy way to build. And they try to kind of give it a certain care. You know, like, okay, what if we take this building block a bit seriously? You know, what can it do? For me, it was quite inspiring. I was also quite inspired by a Danish neoclassical architect who, you see, his house is a bit the same. It's built with this kind of, a bit like concrete blocks, or at least it has the appearance of that. And what I really liked with him was that you see in his drawings, like this house is so simple, but you see the amount of care that is put into the drawing. You know, like it's not whatever. And I would, if I were Paul, I would not like that from students if they come as whatever, because it's not whatever. You really have to, you have to give your project a lot of care. Like when you cook, let's say. And this is kind of what he does, you know, he makes this frame around, he takes care to color it and so on. So I kind of wanted to just like draw like him. So I started to work. This is not watercolor, it's a bit like a tush, it's a bit like a lacquer, kind of, but you apply it as you apply watercolor. And I tried to kind of capture the essence of this house by using, this is just one color. It's called Payne's Gray. It's from an English actually painter who kind of made this pigment. So this is just layers of Payne's Gray. But I tried to see what happens with this house if you take away all these kind of neoclassical ornaments and so on. So this is kind of, we jumped now one floor, but I tried to really start to imagine like what happens if this house becomes a bit like this sort of, a bit like this shell structure, you know, it's a monolithic, from the outside it's kind of monolithic form, but it's really sort of carved out. I would say this is not like, in terms of design, it's not that for example, I will never put the staircase in the middle, because I don't like symmetry so much, but I tried to kind of stay in his vibe a bit, but I regret it a bit. I was not brave enough. I should have moved the staircase kind of off center. This is the last one. But this was also an attempt, actually, in terms of representation, it's really an attempt to make drawings as kind of sculptural as the models. So this you can do, you know. I mean, either you have the model, and the drawings is black and white. But this was an attempt to move towards that. It was also a period where I didn't have a workshop. So I just literally couldn't build stuff. So I kind of was just sit to drawing. Now, around 2 years ago, it was actually in the middle of the pandemic, I started my own practice, and it was actually, it started with this project. It was a developer who bought the plot, which is the grey house, the kind of L-shaped grey house, and he wanted to, he had a little part of the plot which was vacant, a void, really, in the city. And he wanted to look at the possibilities of making something there. So this is kind of the intervention, it's sort of this kind of yellow block. And this one I'm going to go through a bit freely. Like what I want to explain here is more like what happens with this kind of sculptural language when you're confronted with actually many problems. So like here, we had to provide, let's say, trash cans. We had to provide, of course, this toilet with the kind of handicap circle. The kind of staircase is the entrance. This was a bakery, so on the ground floor, and then it's an apartment on the top floor. And we also, I say we because I did it with an architect called Daisy Chetwin. And we also had to meet the developer's requirement because he wanted to make it as big as possible. And this you will also confront to make as much floor area as possible. So we had to find a way to how to meet the existing buildings. This is just to show you, this is from an earlier competition in Venice, which was a funny one. But I think what is interesting with this one was that what I tried to do was actually to create these sort of niches, not for humans, but also like for animals. And for sculpture and so on, but you have this kind of idea of a facade that sort of interact with the outside. And when we were confronted with the actual project, we tried to do the same. So we kind of provided this bench towards the street to give a sort of something a bit public that that you can sit on, even though you don't maybe are in the bakery. This is the second floor. This is sort of where the apartment was. It would be this sort of open plan. I think also referring back to this alphabet, you can kind of maybe start to see these shapes. There's this kind of quarter circle and so on. We try to make this sort of as simple as possible. We were also quite inspired by kind of the Baroque. This is, I don't know in England. Actually, the Nordic Baroque, let's say, looks a bit like this one. So what the Baroque did was that they really tried to, of course, they really tried to soften everything. But also these villas, which are a bit outside Copenhagen, is quite beautiful because they're also always like very overgrown with plants. So they almost become this sort of a bit like a ruin. And this was also what we tried here. We kind of work with this language, and we also then work with the language on the top. So we start to kind of cut it, both in plan and elevation. And the plan was actually to have things, is not represented here, but to have plants growing up, that it really becomes this kind of, overgrown ruin. Here you see like the bedrooms. So this was also a bit a requirement for the developer. Like I need to have 3 bedrooms, so this is fine. Okay, so we've tried to fix that. It's oven light. I can't point, but it's like you see this kind of square which is rotated. That is the oven light. The light comes from above. So this is how the facade looked from the outside. I think here again is a bit kind of confronted with the symmetry. I mean, especially this window in the forehead. But this is literally where the room is. But you can of course start to play with that. Like now we're in a dialogue with the client because it's going to get built. So it's a bit like what we do with this window. If we want to make a trick to move it a bit off center, or that we just sort of accept it. Here you have the sections. What was really kind of the requirement here is that this is sort of how steep you can make a staircase. This is sort of the maximum. So that was actually what really sort of started to define how many floors and also like the floor to ceiling height of the project. This is the roof terrace. You can see with the 2 roof lights is one roof light which is a bit sort of like this shape. The other one is a square. And here you start to see from the back. I think architecturally, this idea of this sort of shell, I think start to, at least to my eyes, start to appear a bit in this drawing. That you have this sort of, it's almost like you start with the block, but you really start to carve it, you start to hollow it out, and everything here is related to daylight. It's like how to get a very nice daylight. So for example, the roof light is placed in that place of the building, which is the hallway where you don't have any daylight. So, it's also this it's actually the whole build-up of this project is completely rational. Like it's nothing that is sort of, or it's always this tension between like, you want it to make it look beautiful, but it also has to be rational. This is from the other side. You start a bit to see the same thing. This is from the roof terrace, or like an image from the roof terrace. This is from the back. I think when it comes to sculpture, we have to also remember like all the Egyptian sculpture, all the Roman sculpture and so on, they were actually always painted, which is a thing I always find completely fascinating. So all our image of sculpture, of architecture is actually is not true. Like if you see like this movie Gladiator or something like that, it's just not true how it is. First of all, they didn't speak English, but also like the buildings didn't look like that. They didn't look like ruins. They looked like the statue to the right. So everything had this kind of. It was a bit like for me. I kind of prefer the statue to the right. I mean, this is kind of a discussion we can have because I like this idea of it's more of a celebration. I do like this kind of this thing, and this is kind of why I want to end with this last drawing, which was. Actually, this was just a commission to a client, like he wanted a painting. But this is just to say that to work with this language, for me at least, you can also start to add color to it. You can also start to add life to it. It's a little bit like you can kind of choose. You can really reduce it, like the parking structure is really reduced into like nothing, but you can also start to add. It's a bit like what I like this with but with grandmothers in a way. You know, like they come into a place, it could be quite shitty, but then they start to put the plants there and water it and start to make it kind of nice. And I think this is also something that we can, it's also something to consider. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's it.
One thing we talked about yesterday is this idea that when you make a render, sometimes you need to start applying materials in the render and it becomes very realistic. But it never really looks like a real building unless you're a wizard and you can really render high resolution stuff. I think the beauty of Chris's work is that all of these models are very suggestive. You know, they imply what the material might be, but it's not so precise. You know, we don't know if that's brick, or if it's rammed earth, or if it's concrete with a pigment, and it leaves something open to interpretation. So someone looking at that can imagine. You know, so I would invite you or kind of advise you to try and do models in this way, because first of all, if you make a model, you make a really good model, you can get a very good image out of the model as well. So you've got the three-dimensional thing, and you can get the image out of it.
There was no render.
There was not one render in the.
I don't like render at all. And I don't. I mean, we do renders, but we only do it for the client. And I don't want to show it to you because it doesn't really inspire anything. So we do this because I only do it because I have to. And it's kind of often it's a bit of a waste of time because it takes a lot of time and it never looks really good. So I would say rather make a render. I think the next step in this one, and that will be the next project phase where we do like the construction drawings, will be to make models, to really choose a material. Is it going to be concrete block, whatever, and start to build it up with that material. So this is a first phase project. I mean, but that would be the natural next step, you know, to really commit to a material, and that would lead the design further. But I think with render is kind of, and I remember I never seen a good render. I just don't have.
More questions?
With your exploration of the Lithic language, did you ever try to push outside of the language that you have found? So different shapes to try and have similar forms within the building?
I mean like the alphabet of it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think definitely. I think the one that really inspired me in a way is this drawing by Gaudi, like this one, for example. But I would say here you can also see Frank Gehry, for example. I mean, what they do in a way is that they like Frank Gehry, for example, he would just never make. Do you know this guy, this American architect? He would just never make a 90-degree corner. He would still make a. He will make a quadrilateral, let's say. It has 4 points, but it's a bit skewed. So that's his kind of what he adds to it. Or the same with Gaudi, you still have to work with rooms. Like a house is still it's still made of rooms, but he makes his own interpretation. He say, okay, they're never going to be completely straight. And he does that not only in plan, but also in elevation. So you have this kind of, it's really become this kind of a full thing. So I think that would be, let's say, what he does here, you can completely imagine to do that with this project as well. Like, let's say here, like why are the facades, why are they completely straight? We can also bend them a little bit. So you sort of bend the light a little bit and have a dialogue with the client, like that we don't take away too much area. You could do that. And then it would be even more dynamic, let's say.
Okay, I'm going to provoke a bit. Can you go to the statues? Because the two statues for me is, the one on the left is so pure in and of itself, it's just the material, and it's quite perfect. And the one on the right is, of course, you lose it because you add this new material on top. It's a very thin material, it's just paint. But for me, you lose the original material, which was for me perfect. So I'm just curious why you would do that. You know, if I was making this room and it's a beautiful wood, you know, I would almost just leave it as beautiful wood. But the idea that then I would paint this wood, I think you kind of lose the woodness. And here, I think you lose the kind of marbleness of it. So I'm just curious what you think.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, I'm kind of curious to ask, maybe we do like a hand. So which one do you like? Everyone who likes the one to the left, raise the hand. Best. Who would like the one to the right? Yeah? It's my buddy there.
You're on your own.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, Ollie, why do you like the one on the right?
Well, I think a clue to it, I think, no, but it's kind of funny because when we did this, it came out of a paper that we did together, actually. It was for a conference in Scotland, and it came because we started to research these figurines, these marble figurines. And I didn't know this, but you know these small figurines? You can see it in the British Museum, for example, that people had, you know, for comfort, let's say. And I realized that for these figurines, they would choose the best marble. It was very important because it has like a spiritual value. But actually, after that, they would paint it to kind of make it their own, you know. So it's not so abstract anymore. It becomes your own. It's a bit like this grandma thing. Like when they go into a house, they have to put their touch a little bit on it to make it into their home, let's say. So I'm not sure. I mean, for me, I work in both languages. I just want to. Now it's clear you all like the white one, so then.
But I think it's also something to do with the value that we appreciate, maybe, and the idea that it seems that nowadays you appreciate the value of them. People pay loads to have like a marble kitchen countertop or something. Everybody's after the texture of the marble, and the idea that you would add value by adding a minute, thin layer of paint seems kind of absurd from the contemporary perspective. But it's interesting because they obviously thought it's so precious, and I'm adding more value. I'm showing the importance of this thing.
Yeah.
I think by adding paint.
Yeah, I think it is something like that. I think I have a friend of mine, like a Russian friend, and he grew up in Soviet Union. And he told me his grandfather, he thought it was too, like, you call it bougie, like bourgeois, like too bougie to have furniture. So he would clad all the furniture with newspaper. Okay. He would clad with a thin layer of newspaper because then it doesn't represent anything. It doesn't represent wealth. And I don't know. Let's say with Corbusier, he does it a lot. Like he has a concrete structure, but then he would paint on surface in a strong colors. So it's more, for me, it's not like I just want to open up the discussion because I do think it is. But I like it. A sculpture like Chilida, for example, would agree with you. You would say, why would you do that? It's like you have a beautiful piece of stone, or whatever, you cut it, and that's it. So. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Chris, I think that it's really interesting when you show these two examples because with the colour it seems, because they're not used to it, they're not used to seeing a statue like that with colour. So it seems to cheapen it when you have the colour. Whereas we're used to one on the left, and it's more classical, it's more serious, more sombre. I think if we were used to seeing sculptures with colour in them, perhaps our perceptions might be different.
I think so, and I think it's actually is a British artist that I love. Who what he does is he takes these sculptures, he takes them and he puts jewelry onto them. He's like, I think he's British Jamaican or something. I don't know if you know him. But he makes these sculptures so beautiful. Like he gives them beautiful clothes, lots of gold. Yeah, no one knows this guy? You know the guy? I mean, he adds something to this. For me, the one to the left is also quite sterile. It's also quite sort of, it's pure. That's it to me.
It's interesting that he shows the Orstelling Pavilion plan, and I don't know if you've seen it, but there is, I think they did a white version of it, and they painted it all in white, whereas the original, obviously, is a mise
Yeah, and not for the better, I can imagine.
I think we had a debate about that previously. I think maybe with the first year, when they were in the first year, they saw the two versions, and again, some liked it, some did.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an important point because I also think this tension, I mean, tension really matters. And actually, Paul showed a very nice quote yesterday for the 2-year student from Jung, I think.
Mhm.
But it was this kind of, I think also when you work with a monolithic, you have to work with thinness as well. In the Barcelona Pavilion, you have a wall made of marble, but it's not structural. So instead of that, he puts a chrome column right next to the, I cannot, it's a bit, yeah. You see these columns, they are right next to the wall, and the wall is not structural. And if you were to have a perspective, you would see that these walls are marble. So he kind of completely plays with the electrics, he completely plays with our perception of what is what. I think that is the, and I think a little bit if you make everything white, you sort of also lose a bit what he's actually trying to achieve. Yeah. You know, when you put, let's say in this pavilion, the whole plinth is made of travertine, for example. So you have a chrome column that is completely dematerialized, going straight into a travertine base. It's completely made of stone. And this tension makes it incredibly beautiful. Yeah.
So yeah, you can see that Chris really like studies things, you know, and it's like really, you know, more so than I think. It's a real. It takes time, you know, and you will develop this in your careers. But it's like I think in a lot of architecture, we take it, we look at things on maybe websites, and it's about the image of the thing, what it looks like from the outside. But really, it's important to study a plan, and it can be, if you can try and do that in your plans, put a piece of trace over it and just kind of squint your eyes and mark out what are the key things here. What is the architect trying to do, and what could I reduce it to? You know, then suddenly you begin to see a building as a diagram. It's just it's ultimately just a diagram. So it's a really nice skill to try and learn, and it really helps you to develop a project. Because there's so many layers involved in a project, but in a way, you don't really need to know that till the very end. You know, in the beginning, you need to know the key moves and the key elements.
Yeah, and I think also what I almost want you to take out of this lecture is almost like the beginning. I would love for you to come out of this like architecture doesn't have to be more complicated than this. And this should give also a great comfort, because we have to deal with gravity, we have to deal with very concrete things, we have to deal with daylight, and we have to deal with the material.